My job today is really to kind of just give you something different to think about, some new ways to think about some of the stuff that might be familiar to us. So I'm going to start out with the premise that Stonewall Jackson's capture of Harpers Ferry during the Antietam campaign is his greatest achievement of the war. I'm not sure, to be honest, that I agree with that statement, but that's where I'm going to start tonight. Let's see what we can come up with. All right. Let's first just do a quick review for those of you who perhaps have been living under a rock and you don't know who Stonewall Jackson is. He was born January 21st, 1824. Came from very humble backgrounds out in Western Virginia, what today is West Virginia, Clarksville, West Virginia, Clarksburg, West Virginia. And he has, grows up raised by bachelor uncles because he loses both of his parents at a very early age. But that gives him a really strong work ethic because his uncle owns a mill, owns a racetrack. And so Jackson really kind of gets this strong work ethic as he's out there, gets elected constable of the town. And eventually that prepares him to go off to West Point, where he finds that he's not prepared at all. Living out in Western Virginia doesn't necessarily give him that top-notch education that he needs to have at West Point. So he struggles when he's first there, but he puts that work ethic he applies that work ethic and puts it to use, and he works his way up over the course of his time at West Point, slowly rising in the class rankings. It's famously said that had there been a fifth year to the curriculum, many of his classmates believed he would have graduated at the top of the class because of that work ethic of his. I like to tie that back to that sense of resolve that he always liked to show. You may be whatever you resolve to be. And so he really puts that to use when he's at West Point. He goes off with many of his classmates. He serves in the Mexican War. He's lauded for bravery on a couple different occasions where the General of the Army, Winfield Scott, actually calls him out by name to his great embarrassment. Um, he also takes great interest in religion when he's down in Mexico, flirts with the Catholic Church for a while, but ultimately decides that's not quite where his spiritual home is going to land. He'll eventually become a deeply devout Presbyterian, but he does try lots of different things, and that's where he has that first deep connection to God. He'll be a deeply religious man, and that principle guides him throughout the rest of his life. He serves in the pre-war army for a while, has some difficult times down in Florida as he's kind of dealing with the Seminole Indians, but worst of all, his superior, William French, Blinky French. I got to take this off and kind of give you the blinks there. The more he drinks, the more he blinks with Blinky French. So he eventually decides to leave the army when he gets an invitation from the Virginia Military Institute. They need someone to teach natural history and philosophy, today what we would call physics, and they need someone to teach artillery. And because Jackson is a legitimate war hero as an artillerist, he gets that job and he'll move to Lexington, Virginia, spend 10 years on the faculty there. He will get married. His first wife will die in childbirth. He will eventually get remarried, and he and his first wife will have a daughter who dies of jaundice after just a couple weeks. And eventually, in the midst of war, he and his wife will then have another child who will survive. Um, his time as a VMI instructor is somewhat tumultuous. He is brilliant as an artillery instructor, but he's not very good as a physics instructor. He will literally memorize his lessons and recite them back to his students. And he barely understands it himself as he's getting going. But the neat thing is, if you read the student correspondence over his 10 years there, he goes from being Tom Fool Jackson to being someone who's well respected, particularly because of his artillery instruction. It's also there that, we see lots of instances where Jackson takes things quite literally. He takes orders to the letter. He sits overnight one night in the superintendent's office because he's ordered to report at like 4:30 in the evening. He shows up, he's sitting in the instructor's office or the superintendent's office. The superintendent forgets about him, goes out a back door, and Jackson sits there overnight till the superintendent comes back the next morning. That's the sort of tale, and that's a true story. That is a tale that I think best illustrates how literal and how exact Jackson treats orders, which becomes a really important guiding force for good and for ill for him during the Civil War. Of course, Civil War does break out. He becomes known as the Mighty Stonewall because of actions at First Manassas, the anniversary of which was, of course, just earlier this week. And then he cements that reputation through the 1862 Valley Campaign. His partnership with Robert E. Lee via correspondence during that spring gives Lee a great deal of confidence in Jackson so that when they do link up for what becomes the Seven Days campaign, the two of them really gel, and Lee will lean on Jackson pretty heavily from there until Jackson's death later on in the war. So that's our little thumbnail of Stonewall Jackson. Interesting, fascinating character. One of the reasons I admire him so much. Not someone I would want to hang out with, I'll be honest. No one I want to have beer and cigars with and refight the war with. But I think because of his complexities, I think that's why I find him so fascinating. And he's one of those people that literally sees the world in terms of black and white. And when we talk about needing to complicate history and look for those shades of gray, Jackson is one of those people who really is black and white, which to me is fascinating. So if you haven't taken the time to look at Jackson's life in a little more detail, I would encourage you to do so. So what I want to do is kind of situate the siege of Harper's Ferry into his overall career. Because if Jackson's capture of Harper's Ferry is the greatest achievement that he manages to succeed at over the course of the war, how does that fit in with the rest of what he does? And I think, first of all, let's start with the 7 days. We can probably agree that the 7 days is not Jackson's shining moment. It takes place in late June, early July of 1862. If I'm going to rank Jackson's achievements, falling asleep at White Oak Swamp does not count as one of his greatest achievements. And so, thanks to the magic of AI, I was able to generate a picture of what Jackson would look like if he was sleeping during the battle. So, it's probably his low point. I'm mystified by AI. Look at his elbow just sort of resting in the air. He is apparently so rigid. He's able to just lean on air and still manage to do it. Now, as I was trying to, of course, there are no images of Jackson. So that's why I had to resort to AI. And I got having some fun here. And so I got us a second picture of Stonewall Jackson sleeping during the middle of a battle. And here he's got his spectacles on. If you look really close, you can see. I did one of these where he actually had three legs, which was pretty interesting. Here, let's have another one. He's just sort of dozing off. We've got some battle detritus here, over here on the side, and things, this fog of war. So, Jackson in the 7 days, not a shining moment, easy for us to make fun of. So it's really probably not something that's going to rank up. So, if we're juxtaposing Harper's Ferry against that, obviously Harper's Ferry is going to win. So then the Battle of Kernstown, March 23rd, 1862, kind of the prelude to the Valley Campaign. There's enough distance between the Battle of Kernstown and the rest of the actions in the Valley Campaign that we might be able to separate them a little bit. Jackson fans want a little breath there so then they can talk about his undefeated string of victories in the Valley. Kernstown, not a shining moment. You can see here is the actual stone wall. This is, as his men, the Stonewall Brigade, are in using the stone wall as a fortification for defensive position. They start to run out of ammunition and they end up having to pull out against orders. Jackson is going to court-martial Richard Garnett, who's in charge of the Stonewall Brigade, expecting them to somehow hang on. So it's an embarrassing loss for Jackson and causes a lot of controversy and tension within the army as a result. So even though we do have Stonewall, it's not our Stonewall doing a fantastic job here. So how about the Romney campaign in January 1st through the 24th, 1862? He's going to march his men from Winchester out to the west to try to capture Romney, which is being used as a federal supply depot. He chases off a federal army, doesn't really have a big fight. It is such a miserable experience for everyone involved. Men freeze to death and as they're on picket duty. It gets so cold. And Jackson just marched them on. And it doesn't matter that it's snowy. It doesn't matter that it's icy. So he comes back from this thinking like, oh, my men did a really good job. And, they achieved things under pretty adverse conditions. So he's pretty satisfied by it. Nobody else is. He has a revolt in his officer corps that leads to Jackson's eventual resignation, which then eventually gets rescinded because his boss, Joe Johnson, says, if this officer resigns, who can replace him? And but it smears Jackson's reputation in circles in Richmond, because now Jefferson Davis is like, who is this prickly pain in the butt that's out there? So Romney, not a really good time. And of course, this was a good opportunity for me to again play with the AI. So here we have Snowball Jackson on a campaign here in Romney. So. But aside from that, not really a great achievement. Well, how about Gettysburg? July 1st through the 3rd, 1863. And you can see that here he is standing like a stone wall right outside of Lee's headquarters. This dude right here is even looking at him like, hey, General Jackson, so glad to have you here, right? Of course he's not there. But I have this here, and it's not even at the bottom of the list, right? But I have it here because so many people want Jackson to be there, which to me is fascinating. Just psychologically, it's fascinating that so many people want to put him there. But his specter is certainly there. And how many people have said, oh, if Jackson had been there on that first day of July, blah, 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 and the Federals would be driven into the ocean, and Lincoln would be a prisoner, and Mosby would be elected president of the United States, and blah, off and off and off. And so many people want to situate him there. But because his specter hangs over Richard Ewell, and everyone second guesses what Ewell is up to, and well, if Jackson had been here, he'd have done this, he'd have done that. And Chris and I have written about this pretty extensively. And Jackson makes a lot of really, Ewell makes a lot of really informed decisions based on the sorts of things that we know Jackson himself did. Ewell goes out to check a threat on his flank, does his own reconnaissance. We know that Jackson did his own reconnaissance, liked to see things himself, had some trust issues. But Jackson was the master of hitting enemies on the flank. So, of course, he would be concerned if there is a perceived threat on his flank, just as Ewell should have been. Jackson's specter really really looms large over the Battle of Gettysburg, even though he wasn't there. And I think it helps better understand, but also obfuscate our understanding of the Battle of Gettysburg as a result. But I'm pleased to share with you an exclusive photo tonight. We do have photographic evidence that Jackson actually was at Gettysburg. He was not shot at Chancellorsville. And so we can see right here in Lee's headquarters, there he is in the upper story of Lee's headquarters. So we do, in fact, know that he was there. He's providing advice to Lee kind of on the sly, doesn't want folks to know that he's there. He's hanging out with his good friend Elvis Presley, the two of them doing a lot of top secret espionage work. So, a very important presence there. How about Fredericksburg in December of 1862? Jackson comes into town. He's going to be in charge of defending Lee's entire right flank. He's going to stretch his men out and then have to consolidate on the eve of battle, just as the Federals are coming across the field. The last elements of his troops are getting into place. And so Jackson gets a lot of credit at Fredericksburg, excuse me, so much so that the United Daughters of the Confederacy actually erect a monument to him downtown on a wall that's right outside the Presbyterian Church. General Stonewall Jackson, by General Lee's request, on this corner, planned the Battle of Fredericksburg on November 27th, 1862. And an authority no less authoritative than the UDC says so. Which is really kind of sad because Jackson was still on the march to Fredericksburg on November 27th. He never set foot in the town of Fredericksburg. Lee never said, hey, I want you to plan this battle for me. Everything Lee does during the Battle of Fredericksburg is reactive, not proactive. So there are a lot of issues about kind of how we understand Jackson's role or misunderstand Jackson's role at Fredericksburg. One thing we do know is that on the south end of the field, George Gordon Meade's division punches through Jackson's line, and Jubal Early has to disobey orders to march to the sound of the guns and plug that gap. This is the sort of thing that would get Early arrested under other circumstances, but because Early saves the day and in turn saves Jackson's bacon, Early doesn't get reprimanded. Although Jackson refuses to give Early credit for it in his written reports, and Lee, in his written reports, actually provides some cover for Early to protect him from Jackson's bad attitude. So, the southern end of the field, where the Federals have their most success, is against Stonewall Jackson's position. There are more Confederates per square yard in the southern end of the field than anywhere else in the field, and the Federals are still able to break through down there. But he does close the gap. Um, and so he is successful at repulsing that federal attempt, and he's is able to deter further federal incursions. He does that night on December 13th try a counterattack in the dark. His men wear white bands around their sleeves, and they're quickly shot at by federal artillery, and they're chased back into their line. So when he does want to take the offense there, not necessarily so great. So I can only give Jackson a C, and I'm sure Chris, watching behind the scenes, probably wouldn't even give him that much of a rating. As A.P. Hill famously said, setting up for that battle, that Stonewall Jackson gets all the credit, and if there's something that goes wrong here, I'm going to be the one who gets the blame. And in fact, Hill does get the blame for that. So Jackson really has a pretty mixed bag there at Fredericksburg. How about Cedar Mountain, August 9th, 1862? Love this painting, Don Traioni, and Jackson's got his sword out. His hair is wild. He's lost his kepi. The sword is rusted into the scabbard. He's able to rally his men at the point of crisis, at the moment of near collapse, and he's able to holler, "Jackson is with you," and lead his men into a rally that allows them to turn the tide of battle. So Cedar Mountain turns out to be a pretty dramatic story. It turns out to be a pretty successful story, but let's not forget he's fighting Nathaniel Banks. Okay, she's already smacked Banks around during the Valley campaign. Banks, who will get shuffled around because he's got important political connections, never gets fired. But let's say that Banks never quite rises to the occasion that he needs to rise to either. So, if we're talking about the Union B team, Banks, B for Banks, right? So, I don't know that this action really rates much higher on this list, only because Jackson's losing to this point in the battle to Nathaniel Banks, right? And so it takes this great moment of drama to reverse the tide of battle. It turns out to be a win. And then Jackson's able to withdraw, and Pope gets scared off and withdraws as well. So again, sort of mixed results here. Okay, how about the Battle of Antietam? Jackson successfully captures Harpers Ferry on the 15th. He marches up to Antietam, gets his men in line, and then the early morning part of that battle engages in one of the most epic slugfests of the entire Civil War. And there's a lot of back and forth fighting. Much of it has become iconic. Here we see him behind the Dunker Church as he's riding among wounded Confederates. Hill's Texas Brigade coming up into the fight. It just turns out to be, I think, one of his best battlefield performances. Like on a single given day, Jackson is able to continue to hold off federal attacks that come from the north, that come from the east. He does lose ground, but he's able to hold on enough. And as we know, that whole battle just is a day-long slugfest. And Jackson, opening that battle, manages to represent himself well. So I'm going to give him pretty good marks on this one. So now we're starting to get into like those things that we really need to kind of pay attention to as far as some of his great achievements. How does this tie in with Harper's Ferry? We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. How about Chancellorsville, May 1st and 2nd? Of course, the battle lasts longer than that, but Jackson's part in the battle doesn't last longer than that. May 1st to the 2nd, 1863. And he's kind of off in the distance here in the background. If you kind of see him in the woods off in this little corner here. Um, he is able to lead a portion of Lee's divided army on a flank march through the wilderness, 70 square miles of second growth forest. He's on a 13-mile march on a road that doesn't even show up on the map, putting his men on the unsuspecting flank of the Union army, smashing into them, rolling them up, as one Federal says, like a wet blanket, driving them pell-mell to the east, completely throwing off their game. Jackson's flank attack is generally considered one of the great, brilliant maneuvers of the war. And indeed, it's pretty impressive right up till the moment where he gets himself shot. And it's like, so like maybe this would rank higher on the list, but he ends up dead at the end of the story. So I don't know that we can really count this as his greatest achievement, even though many people would. We also have to consider that at the moment of when he's shot, Lee's army is divided. And Robert E. Lee's got 14,000 guys. Lee's got 28, or Jackson's got 28,000 guys. And in between them, big, angry, wounded Joe Hooker's army. And so Lee's Confederate forces are dangerously divided. Plus, they've got a force that's back in Fredericksburg under Jubal Early. Plus, there's a quarter of the army with James Longstreet and Suffolk. So Lee's army is literally scattered all over the map at the moment of Jackson's wounding. And it's a precarious situation for Lee to then have to patch back together. So Jackson's execution of the flanking maneuver is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The position he leaves his men in and he leaves the army in, perhaps not so brilliant. I consider Jackson's wounding at Chancellorsville maybe the best thing that could have happened to Lee at that moment, because if we consider what Jackson wanted to do from here on in, he's going to, try to throw his exhausted reserve division into two fresh corps, the First and Fifth Corps. So again, Chancellorsville, pretty good, but he does end up dead. So then we've got First Manassas, July 1st, 1861. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. He positions his men. He marches to the sound of the gun, positions them behind the crest of a hill, gets his artillery involved, and then is able to position his men to fend off a Federal attack. And in doing so, other Confederates rally around him. Bernard B., South Carolinian, leading some Alabamians, says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." If you believe the Virginia writ large version, B says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us rally around the Virginians." The Virginians love that version of the story. In fact, there were no Virginians who heard him yell that out, though. In fact, we only have 4 eyewitness accounts, two of them written years and years later. So we don't know what B says, other than he calls Jackson Stonewall. Some people say, oh, it was an insult. He's, standing there like a stone wall, not moving. His men wouldn't have adopted that as a nickname, the Stonewall Brigade, if that was an insult. So Jackson stands there as a stone wall. Confederate forces rally around him. The tide of battle turns, and the Confederates win the day. And Jackson gets that cool nickname, Stonewall Jackson. Or, we could call him Arnold Schwarzenegger. We could call him Ares, the god of war. There are lots of different things we could call Jackson. The fact that he's all bulked up like this, those of us who are Civil War buffs, we're not that buff, are we? We know Jackson wasn't built that way, but in memory, he has taken on those sorts of superhuman proportions. He's even wearing a cape in this statue. We might as well just put a big S on his chest for Stonewall. And First Manassas becomes, I think, a really, really important highlight in Jackson's overall career. It's the birth of Stonewall. But let's remember, after First Manassas, he has a fairly uneventful autumn, but then there is the Romney campaign, and then there's Kernstown. So the great Stonewall Jackson has a pretty mixed record by the time he goes into the Valley campaign. So, again, First Manassas important, but is it the creme de la creme? I don't think it is. Okay. So let's look at Second Manassas. So he just kind of goes down the road a little bit, hunkers down in a railroad bed, and then starts throwing rocks at the Federals. And, because it's the Iron Brigade, rocks just bounce off iron, of course. It is, I think, just a sensational battlefield performance by his corps. They hunker down, they hold on, they fight desperately, they fix John Pope's attention. That allows Lee the time to move the rest of his forces into position. So James Longstreet then rolls up that massive sweeping punch on the 30th that throws Pope's men into pell mell. And Longstreet rightly gets the attention he deserves there for driving the Federals off that field. But had Stonewall Jackson not fixed his men in place, had not fixed Pope's attention, I don't think the rest of Second Manassas would have worked out as it had. So I really give Jackson high marks for Second Manassas. My friend John Hennessy said that Second Manassas is where Lee's whole team works at its peak performance as a team. And so Jackson is one of those legs of that tripod with Longstreet and Stewart. Super, super important. So I'm going to give him pretty high marks for Second Manassas. Aside from, like leading into that battle, he has that huge, essentially flanking maneuver where he gets into Pope's rear. He captures Manassas Junction, gets all those much needed supplies, burns the rest, chooses the ground. So everything leading up to that first encounter is really important foundationally to dictate how the rest of that battle unfolds. So I'm going to give them pretty high marks operationally, tactically, and really kind of laying out Lee's strategy. So now if we're going to, when we start thinking about Harper's Ferry, I want you to think about those operational levels, those tactical levels, how it is what's going on the battlefield, fulfilling the strategic vision of the commander. Here we've got a really great vision of how that all comes together. I'm going to say that Harper's Ferry does that as well. We got the Valley Campaign, May through June of 1862. This is where Stonewall Jackson becomes Stonewall Jackson, literally the most famous Confederate in the world because he starts to rack up all these victories. And pretty soon, Kernstown gets forgotten about, Romney gets forgotten about, and that mighty Stonewall that we saw at First Manassas, that reputation continues to grow and grow and grow. I've done a lot of work looking at the way the media covered Jackson during this period. And if you think about everything else going on throughout the Confederacy, where things are just, they're terrible. They are terrible. And you've, had the loss of New Orleans, and McClellan is getting bogged down, marching up the peninsula. You've had the Battle of Hampton Roads. It's inconclusive, and the Confederates end up having to give up their ironclad as a result of that. So it's just lots of bad news. And of course, the Battle of Shiloh, let's not forget about that, when the shock to the system that Shiloh turns out to be. So you've got all this bad news in the spring, and then suddenly Jackson starts winning. And there again, against the B team. It's early in the war. We don't know how the war is going to end up, so we don't necessarily know it's the B team yet. Only hindsight lets us see that. So it allows folks across the South, it allows newspaper editors, and it allows Northerners to start seeing the rise of this guy and the legend being born. And the media makes incredible hay out of Jackson's Valley Campaign. Even though they're relatively small battles against relatively poor commanders, it's a bright spot. So the Valley Campaign really turned Stonewall Jackson into Stonewall Jackson. We wouldn't have him without it. And so I really look at it in that overall context and think, gosh, this is great. Strategically, Lee is really worried about the movement of McClellan up the peninsula against Joe Johnson. At this point, Lee is the military advisor for Jeff Davis. And there are federal forces in the Fredericksburg area under Irvin McDowell that could move down to create a pincer movement against Johnson. So the strategy here is really to kind of fix McDowell in place by threatening Washington through the Valley Campaign. And so strategically, Jackson's moves are really important. Operationally, he does an effective job getting his troops across vast distances over short periods of time. That home field advantage really comes through for him. And tactically, he manages to pull out victory after victory, even if some of them are relatively small. And so here is really kind of where that legend of Jackson is born. And we can kind of see the lemon here. We got some of our first accounts of Jackson loving lemons. If we're going to have a myth, we're going to have a legend, we got to have some color, and the color happens to be lemon yellow as part of this story. So I used AI, like let's Stonewall Jackson and lemons, and here we have Stonewall drinking a Stonewall lemonade, just adorned with lemons around him, one of the most enduring parts of the Jackson myth. So how about Harper's Ferry? That finally brings us to Harper's Ferry, where I'm gonna say this is his single most important achievement of the war, with the Valley Campaign behind that and Second Manassas behind that. September 12th through the 15th, he comes riding into town here. He knows Harper's Ferry well. If you don't, let's take a look real quick at this convenient map that the Park Service has created for us. Jackson rides into downtown to go to the visitor center to get a copy of this map so that he knows what's going on. Harper's Ferry sits at the bottom of a huge valley with mountains around it. So to the north in Maryland, we have the creatively named Maryland Heights. In the South in Virginia, we have the less creatively named Loudoun Heights. It's not Virginia Heights, in case you were going to guess that. And then over here we have Bolivar Heights. And then beyond that, we're going to have Schoolhouse Ridge. So we're going to have this series of ridges extending out this way. So the village itself is down in here. The arsenal is off in this area. And this has really kind of been a strategic point of contention throughout the war. And it's essentially indefensible because the village sits down in this valley, and it's the key to the whole position are these heights. And if you can occupy the heights on either side or behind it, you can trap whoever's down in there. Jackson knows this well because he has spent a lot of time in Harper's Ferry. He was actually stationed there. His first visit relates to Harper's Ferry in December of 1852. He supervises the Corps of Cadets from VMI as they provide security for the execution of John Brown. And we see him here in this historic sketch. We know it's Jackson because he's got a lemon in his haversack there. And they're going to make sure that nobody gets out of line during the Brown execution because there have been threats of violence. There is that fear that the radicals are going to come in here and to try to rescue Brown, and so Jackson is going to supervise what's going on there. Charlestown just a couple miles away from Harper's Ferry, so that's really Jackson's first exposure to the area here. Oh, there we go. So then in May of 1861, he gets assigned there after he takes the Corps of Cadets to Richmond. The cadets themselves are going to provide military training for all these new recruits that are flooding into the Virginia militia at that time. And Jackson's going to get an assignment to Harper's Ferry because it's a strategically important position. And he will spend about 6 weeks there, and he will make himself intimately familiar with the topography. Here we see in this painting by John Paul Strain, he's still wearing his uniform from VMI, and he's going to go on the heights. He's going to inspect the entire Confederate position every day. He's going to go to different spots at different times each day to keep people on their toes, so they never know when he's going to show up. And this routine really allows him to gain insights into this position because he's thinking like, if I have to defend this position, how am I going to do it? Well, let me think like if I was going to attack this position, how would I attack it? And that's going to then guide his decision making to figure out how to defend it while he's there. Joe Johnson will eventually show up and he will supersede Jackson in command. And so then Jackson will be sent off to do some other stuff underneath Johnson's command. But this time at Harper's Ferry is super formative for Jackson because he's got raw recruits coming in that he has to turn into soldiers. He's going to have his key members of his staff start showing up, including Hunter Holmes McGuire, his surgeon, who Jackson doesn't believe, like he thinks he's too young. So when McGuire shows up, Jackson says, "All right, well, report to your tent and I'll call for you." And a week passes, and McGuire's like, "Did he forget about me?" And when Jackson finally talks to him, he says, "Yeah, you just seem too young. I had to send to Richmond and get verification." The two of them become very close over the course. Probably his most important relationship of the war is also established there, and that's where he meets his horse, Little Sorrel, who he also calls Fancy. He gets this horse for his wife, and he gets himself a much bigger horse. And yeah, the horse that he gets for himself just a little too wild and uncontrollable. But Little Sorrel, much more gentle, much more even-tempered, and so captured as part of a federal horse shipment. John Harmon, Jackson's quartermaster, is the one who presents these horses to him. And so Little Sorrel will go with Jackson throughout the rest of the war. And occasionally Jackson will swap out for a fresh horse now and then. But Little Sorrel becomes very synonymous with Stonewall Jackson, a very important partnership. So with all of that knowledge in mind, Jackson pays a call to Harpers Ferry on May 28th, 1862, as part of the Valley Campaign. He's been marching up and down the valley, going out to McDowell, going to Front Royal, going to Winchester, and he's going to chase Nathaniel Banks all the way up across the Potomac River. And the Stonewall Brigade in the lead will get as far as Charlestown, and they'll kind of hunker down, and then they'll feel their way toward Harper's Ferry, trying to figure out, like, is there an opportunity here? Can we recapture Harper's Ferry? And so, as all this is going on, the rest of the federal forces who are still scattered around Western Virginia begin to converge on Jackson, and it'll eventually force him to turn around and march all the way from up here around Harper's Ferry and Charlestown back down to Strasburg, where he's going to slip through in the very narrowest skin of his teeth. It's, I think, one of his most incredible feats of the war as he marches his men more than 35 miles, boom, 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 in the pouring rain. And because he's got some rather tepid aggressiveness, it's probably an oxymoron, isn't it? But because he's got some federal commanders, John Fremont and Shields, coming at him from both ends, they're not really squeezing the vice. He's able to slip through. But while he's at Harper's Ferry, the federal garrison there, under Brigadier General Rufus Saxon, is going to take his 8,000 men and close off that peninsula. So it's going to then kind of go from the Potomac to the Shenandoah River and prevent Jackson's men from kind of pushing into Harper's Ferry. The other key part of that, though, is that Saxon realizes the heights to the north and south of the town are vital, and so he actually is going to put some troops on both of those positions to hold them for a little bit. And it's only when some of his troops are driven off of Loudon Heights to the south that he's going to have to give up his position, consolidate. He's going to go from a 2,000-yard front down to a 900-yard front, but still not have to give up the position. And he's going to be able to hold the Stonewall Brigade off. Jackson eventually just runs out of time, and that's when he has to begin that withdrawal down to Strasburg. But Jackson had a general idea, like, if there's an opportunity here, let's take it. And Saxon doesn't provide that opportunity. So that becomes kind of a key bit of context for Jackson as he then thinks ahead toward his next time going to Harper's Ferry. That's going to be in September 1862 as part of the Maryland campaign. So here we are into the meat of the story. Robert E. Lee, as he's moving into Maryland, decides that he can't have the federal garrison at Harper's Ferry in his rear, threatening his supply line. I should mention at this point, the garrison has gone back and forth between Confederate and federal hands a couple different times over the course of the war, because remember, Jackson started the war there, and it's going to then fall back to federal hands. Um, Lee can't have this in his rear, and he's hoping as he moves into Maryland, it's just going to flush him out, but it doesn't. So now we got to figure out what to do with it. So he's going to devise a plan where he's going to take basically. six of his nine divisions under his command and give them to Jackson, who is then to advance on Harper's Ferry and capture the garrison. Where the other three divisions under James Longstreet are going to move toward Boonesboro and continue that movement up into Maryland to lead the way, and then Jackson will force the capitulation of Harper's Ferry and then rejoin the army. But Jackson's not just going to take these 28,000 men and go invade Harper's Ferry. He's going to split his column into three. And so he's going to have General John G. Walker come down here from the south and occupy Loudon Heights, because again, Jackson knows these heights are the key to this position. Up to the north, off the map, you can see this section of mountains here. If we were to continue up there, that's South Mountain. Lafayette McLaws or Lafayette McLaws is going to occupy that position and eventually kind of come down here and threaten Harper's Ferry. From the north, there's a naval battery that's going to be up here, a federal naval battery, and they're going to have to abandon their position when McLaws comes creeping down the mountain. And then Jackson is going to take about 14,000 men and circle to the north and come down around and then come onto our map from over here in the west. And what's amazing about this maneuver is that Jackson's got two mountains to cross. He's got the Catoctin Mountain, the South Mountain to cross, and then he's got to get across the Potomac River and then circle around while he coordinates with Walker and McLaws so that they are all converging at relatively the same time. And the idea is that they're going to show up and they're going to spook the Federals, and if that doesn't work, then we're going to use the artillery from these dominating positions to try to bombard the town into capitulation. The federal commander who's in charge of this garrison, Dixon Miles, has got about 14,000 guys. And as Jackson's converging, and Lee is carrying out his plan. This is when George McClellan discovers the lost order, Order 191, and now he knows what Lee's up to. It's a couple days old by the time McClellan gets it, so it's not fresh intelligence, but it's enough for McClellan to say, without, if I can't whip Bobby Lee with this, I'm gonna go home. So everyone at Harper's Ferry is freaking out, like, "Oh gosh, Confederates are going to be converging on you." People are so scared, and they're additionally nervous because, geez, we're going to get trapped here. And so Miles is then going to try to hunker down, and he's going to move his guys out to Bolivar Heights and try to close off the peninsula, just as Saxton had done earlier. But whereas Saxton goes from the Potomac down to the Shenandoah. Here, Miles is going to leave his left flank exposed. He's going to try to refuse that line a little bit by shifting some reinforcements over there, but he's hoping that this is going to be enough to kind of hold off the Confederates. So when they first show up, Jackson begins to bombard the garrison, and artillery is not going to be enough to force Harper's Ferry's capitulation. And Jackson's going to get a little frustrated, but he knows that if he just does a frontal assault here, he's not in a particularly advantageous position. He knows here along Schoolhouse Ridge, along this area here on land that's been preserved by the American Battlefield Trust and your support. Thank you very much. This Schoolhouse Ridge is about 200 yards or 200 feet in elevation lower than Bolivar Heights. So Miles has an artillery advantage. So Jackson's not eager to just do a frontal assault. What he eventually is going to do, because the clock is ticking. Lee is up there with his three divisions. The whole army's waiting on him to force this surrender. If it doesn't happen, the whole campaign is going to be toast. And so eventually, what Jackson's going to do is he's going to slip some of his artillery across the river, and Stapleton Crutchfield is going to set up with about with a battalion of artillery on a little plateau of land. Suddenly, this is going to be able to enfilade the federal position. Crutchfield is going to make this maneuver overnight, September 13th through September 14th through the 15th. As he's doing that, A.P. Hill's division is going to swing down here and scale the heights. This is just awful, awful topography. That's one reason why Miles feels like it's secure. And of course, Hill's going to be able to exploit that false sense of security. So as Hill gets onto the flank here, Jackson's going to launch some diversionary attacks right here, kind of up the middle, and pin these guys into place. And that's going to allow Hill to sweep forward and Crutchfield to start blasting. By the time Miles discovers all this, he's going to shift guys a little too late, and it's going to allow Hill to get in his rear. And as the whole thing collapses in on Miles, he's then going to offer his surrender. In the course of all those discussions, a cannonball is going to come in. It's going to explode behind him. The shrapnel is going to shred all the skin off one of his legs. He'll eventually die a couple of days later. But he'll say he was an old soldier just doing his duty. As a result of this, 14,000 men will fall captive to Stonewall Jackson, an incredible feat. And as Chris pointed out earlier, it's going to be the largest surrender of U.S. forces until World War II. Up to this point, Lee's getting nervous. He's not hearing from Jackson. He's not hearing about the surrender. Up here to the north, we're going to have William Franklin's division show up and come to the rescue, try to save Miles and push through South Mountain. McLaws is going to find himself pretty well besieged. He's going to fall back into Pleasant Valley, which is the valley that's up here. But he's going to be able to hold Franklin off long enough for this action to finish. And so then when Lee finally hears that this all happens, he's relieved because he's literally at the point like, I got to call this off. Things are getting too precarious. But then, oh, wait, Harpers Ferry has fallen. And he calls everybody back together and they're going to concentrate at Sharpsburg. Jackson's going to leave A.P. Hill behind to oversee the surrender, and he's going to take the rest of his troops northward to link up with Lee. And of course, we know that Hill's going to show up after he oversees the surrender. He's going to march on the 17th of September, showing up at the south end of the Antietam battlefield at a moment of crisis, right at the right place, right at the right time to help turn the tide of battle and save Lee's army after the Burnside finally does get across in that southern end of the field. So Harper's Ferry is going to have those ripples that then have huge impact at Antietam. So that's the overview. And we could say, like, is this a fine achievement, or did Jackson just get lucky because he's fighting another member of the B team in a geographically indefensible position with overwhelming numbers? Like, we could make that argument. And I've had a couple of my friends at the Antietam Institute poke me about that one, and I think it's a fair statement. But I think because of Jackson's familiarity with the terrain from earlier in the war, from his stationing there and from his poking at it with the Stonewall Brigade, that gives him important intelligence that informs the way he comes at this. So I think that even if we'd had a different commander, even if we'd have had more aggressiveness from the Federals, if they hadn't just taken a defensive posture, and we do know from the Valley Campaign that Harper's Ferry can be defended as it was during the Valley Campaign. So I think that Jackson really kind of takes all that stuff and applies it operationally and tactically to achieve, I think, something pretty incredible. And if we take a look at the numbers, anywhere, but I've, seen numbers as high as the entire garrison, 14,000. But it's the largest federal surrender until Bataan on April 9th. 1942, where 76,000 Federals, the whole army surrenders. So it's a pretty significant thing for the Confederates to achieve. What else in the Civil War era gives us some context? Well, we've got Ulysses S. Grant capturing Fort Donelson in February. He gets about 13,000, so about the same number. We've got Ulysses S. Grant capturing Vicksburg, about 30,000. We got Appomattox, about 28,000, including the rest of Lee's army. We got the guy who wins the Civil War, is the only other general who's doing anything comparable to what Jackson has accomplished by capturing Harper's Ferry and the number of troops that he's able to get. That's no small feat, in my opinion. And that's pretty good company, in my opinion, as well. So, for context, let's keep that in mind. So perhaps Harper's Ferry is his most incredible feat of the war when you put it in that larger context of what Lee's able to do strategically during the Antietam campaign because of this, of how it stacks up against other achievements in the history not only of the Civil War, but of the United States Army. And
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.